Welcome to LSE for this evening's hybrid event, which is hosted by European Institute. My name is Denise and I'm Professor of Global Politics here at the LSE at the European Institute that is hosting this event. I am exceptionally pleased to welcome you to a discussion of one of the very burning questions of our time, European security. Difficult questions and considerations about European security identity and its distinctiveness have always been part of a new project. But the questions acquired historically unprecedented urgency and importance with the first Russian missiles that landed on Ukraine almost 2 days from, almost 3 days from the third anniversary. And of course, they have been made more pressing with President Donald Trump coming into office. So I'm very pleased that today we'll address this topic with two experts coming from an academic and practitioner perspectives. On my right, Richard Rose, who will be our first speaker tonight, is a political scientist, author, and academic. He is a professor and director of the Center for the Study of Public Policy at the University of Strathclyde, and is a visiting fellow at the Robert Schuman Center of the European University Institute and WZB Berlin Social Science Center. His research on security began by writing his Oxford DPhil on the foreign policy of the 1945-51 Labour government, when he interviewed Prime Minister Clement Attlee and Labour ministers working to create NATO and keep Britain out of Europe. Since then, he has written many books based on fieldwork on the American presidency, British politics, Central and Eastern Europe, and Russia. His remarks tonight will draw on evidence in his new book by Bloomsbury, titled European Security from Ukraine to Washington. I'm also very pleased to welcome Klaus Welle, who is a visiting professor in practice at the LSE European Institute. And he was previously Secretary General of the European Parliament from 2009 to 2022. And his previous roles in Brussels include serving as Chief of Staff to the President of the European Parliament, as Director General for the EU internal policies in the Parliament's administration, and as Secretary General successively of the European People's Party, EPP, Transnational Political Party, and of the EPP political group in the European Parliament. Please give a warm welcome to our speaker. Just a few business remarks. If you have phones on you, please put them on silent. We will be recording this event, and hopefully, if there are no technical glitches, we will have a podcast. And for those of you who are still on X, the hashtag for today's event is hashtag LSCWEI. So I'll ask our speakers to take the floor. Richard will go first for about 15-20 minutes, and then I'll follow.
Right. Well, my book has two dimensions. It covers from Kiev to Washington. It flies over Brussels, and it flies north of London. Because, secondly, it covers a lot of time from Yalta to Yalta, because Yalta is where Stalin, Roosevelt, and Churchill met to decide carving up areas. And of course, it is now back in the news in the Black Sea. I wanted to call my book From the Black Sea to the Potomac, And it was interesting. You all probably know where the Black Sea is better than the Potomac, but others would know the Potomac. So I had to mention countries and places. The first thing, the other thing about the book is it looks equally at Moscow, Washington, and Brussels at 3 time periods. I'll skip what I now call the stable Cold War period because it worked, it deterred aggression, intervention in Hungary or in West Germany. So it lasted a long time. But before we get to what also happened was the attempt to go from military security to economic security, which was not only the Marshall Plan, but more relevant, the Merkel Plan, what you might call the Putin Plan. That if you engage economically with Russia and Eastern Europe and Germany, one will become dependent on the other. But that's a whom question, isn't it? What we're left with now is, I think, 3 types of security which prime ministers and dictators have got to keep in mind and balance differently. The first is economic security, which is how democratic parties get elected. It's a continuing pressure. At the European level, it's the European Central Bank. There's individual security, which is the European Convention on Human Rights, if they can, insofar as they can be enforced in practice. And at the military level, there is collective security, national security is where the members of the European Council start. They don't start with European security. It reinforces national security as they interpret it in their national and political context, which differs between Budapest and Vienna and Berlin, not to mention London. And defense ministries, which can be found, but which have lost their preeminence normally. And the fact that defense has come back as an issue. If you really, how many of you can raise your hand if you can name Britain's Minister of Defense? Germany's Minister of Defense? Yes, it's not a high priority ministry, to put it mildly. You also have the new DG Commission for Defense, which has a Russian speaker, Lithuanian, who has a normal Lithuanian attitude towards security, but no army. This goes back to when I was a student at the LSE, German rearmament was a big issue. The Pleven Plan, the European Defense Community, Monet had set it up. Everything was going fine until the French National Assembly vetoed German rearmament. No problem. The next year, Germany was a member of NATO. And that's really been locked in much stronger. You've got to accept it and then figure out what follows from that. And the NATO, while the European Economic Community has evolved into a European Union, the defense security of North Atlantic has remained up to Trump too very stable. And I would share the assumption, not the speculation, but it's less reliable than it has been. Put it that way. We can debate how much less, but you want You don't want maybe. You want certainty on the command of an army when it's needed. Otherwise, it's too late. Now, perestroika, in my perspective, restructured Europe in two ways. It pushed the borders far to the east, toward, if not toward St. Petersburg is back, and one of the closest EU cities is Narva, which raises a very different issue because, of course, it's Russian-speaking part of the EU and Estonia, and clearly visible to Putin. Maastricht created a European Union with diplomats and now with a defense ministry, but it didn't deal with the armed forces problem. Concurrently and independently, the US tilted to the Pacific. Whether you start with Nixon and Kissinger, who were perhaps early, what you've got now is that Europe, as a problem, must compete in the Oval Office. And I focus on the Oval Office simply because that's where conflicts and priorities get resolved. Someone has to do it. The Secretary of State can only do it if the president doesn't give a damn. But all of these priorities, the war for the president's ear, against Fox News or whatever, competes with China for economic and military importance, with the Middle East for energy, Saudis, and lobbying because of the strong Israeli lobby, and with Putin's Russia for military attention. So you've got, if you're scheduling the president's time, it's a question of who gets how much time and how much retention, leaving aside Trump. But clearly the tilt is to the Pacific. The electoral college votes are there. The special relationship is a figment of an imagination. And as an American, I think it's ridiculous, some of the things I read. What we have with Vladimir Putin, in two sentences, in a characterization, he's a Soviet-style European who sees Europe as a Tsar saw it, running up till you hit Silesia or something like that, who then saw it as Ribbentrop and Molotov saw it. And then he hasn't given that up. He seeks to regain Soviet territory. That's a fair assumption. And he has always been a well-trained and ambitious KGB agent. So don't put anything past him. He doesn't think he's a rational actor KGB agent, which is not the same as liberal international relations theory. Now, what do Europeans think? As democracies, governments have got to carry their population with them. They've got to lead, but they've got to have followers. Not to say they should read the polls, but they should make sure they don't get too far out in front, especially when awkward decisions are taken. And that whether they're taken by Keir Starmer or by Morgan McSweeney is something is irrelevant, but you can't get too far out in front. In autumn 2022, 9 months after the war in Ukraine started, with Brennan Vessels in Berlin, I also have an appointment to visit from Berlin, where I go forth frequently. We did a survey of 8 countries, including Britain and Germany. The first question was asking about risk to this country. Big, fair, not much, but not at all. 88% thought the global economy was at risk. 49% thought military action is at risk. Since when, I would assume that the percentage thinking military action was at risk has gone up 10%. If you guess 25%, I'll guess 24. If you guess 67%, I'll guess 67.7. In other words, there's a tendency to assume that everybody reacts. But then global economic risks have gone up. So you still get the economy as the primary concern of people represented in the European Parliament and in the European Council of nationally elected governments of EU member states. The follow-up question was who can help? For the economy, 39% said the EU can help, one choice. 10% said NATO or the US. 4% said the UN. 46% said we're on our own. Now, this is striking because the Eurobarometer, which does market research to promote the EU, says, would you like more help from the EU? And people say yes. Do you think you're on your own? And particularly on military, do you read Brussels to find out what you do? Or is the national leader of Estonia or of Finland supposed to take the decision himself or herself? And there's still a lot, it's in the national interest. This is where the military comes in. Only 22% think they're on their own in military terms. So what's the alternative? Ordinary people aren't fools. 55% think NATO, another 10% choose the USA. I split it. It's two sides of the same coin, but I didn't want to confuse that the Americanist. In Poland, 20% said the USA. And clearly, Warsaw would loom larger in Washington than Brussels in a way, for various reasons. It would be a perfectly rational thing on the Potomac. 10% said the EU would be important militarily. So you've got the competition between economics. Where are we now? Well, we've got competition for scarce financial and political resources of national members, of European governments, including the UK and Europe for this purpose, and Norway. Given that Starmer says defense is after 2030, but it's clearly a second-tier thing. Germany, I will let Klaus deal with, but that is a unique historical contempt, and we have an election. But different European responses to the proxy war in Ukraine, the Baltic states and Poland are rearming now. Sweden and Finland join NATO. They have a real security policy and priority. The UK is offering sweet 100-year guarantees, some money, some military. They're relatively high within the Europe, but when you take out the US under Trump, they can't fill the gap as things are right now. Germany has got a black zero commitment against defense, against borrowing, and a historic problems, plus a general election, which may or may not produce a stable government. The EU, the problem is strategic autonomy is a device for getting clear of NATO, of US, of Washington, to put it bluntly. But the whole business of recreating the European Defense Force, which Eisenhower had signed up to in 1951, 52, when NATO didn't have an army based in Brussels in the afternoon, if you like. It won't replace that. So the strategic, and Klaus has done an excellent paper on, it sets out everything, but defense, military defense comes last because it's slowest. Now, when the fighting stops in Ukraine, where are we? Reconstruction and economic development will come first. This is something where Ukraine has long-term assets. I mean, it's educated, has raw materials, et cetera, et cetera. U.S. is not going to vote any money. There's a great scope if you want to have a Marshall Plan for Ukraine named after you, just sign the check. Elon Musk could do it. The EU can coordinate what can be given by member states, but it can't vote it. It can work with financial institutions and Ian Begg to solve the problem, but it's a tricky one in practice to get it going. The trickier one, as I see it, is political. This is my last point. The challenge of Ukraine seeking to join the EU. It has a potential to be a major European state, something in between France and Germany and Malta and Bosnia and or Herzegovina or whatever. Ukraine, EU has too many small countries it could use, and with Poland, of course, it would rebalance it. But has its government dealt with its historic corruption? And can it go back from military corruption to this domestic corruption or whatever? It's an empirical question. EU guaranteed bonds would help investment. How can the EU adapt its regional funds by being capped, but still it will be a big poor country competing with Polish agriculture, which the Poles have said, please don't. You know, everything is fine up to a point. Voting rights, unanimity, and this is where you get into the problem of other countries coming in as well. And what I saw last time, and it's documenting, that Romania and Bulgaria were let in too early against the wishes of people who knew what was going on there. But it can happen. Don't say it can't happen again. That would really create too many small states that aren't accustomed to dealing with European business the way that small Scandinavian countries are. And it needs to be separated. And is it secure in military terms? There is a very real question, and this is where the now in the title, that when the fighting stops and talk with Ukraine comes up, Brussels and Ukraine will get together on the political and the economic side, but they are talking about building ties with something for which there cannot be a military guarantee. And in a funny sense, the more the joint expeditionary force on the Baltic side which is already there, is credible, the more it pushes Putin to keep his eye on Ukraine. Pause to Klaus.
I use this. Thank you very much, Richard. We are doing a double act today. So you get it in stereo from two perspectives. I would like to start the following way. Why are we discussing European defense? We are discussing European defense because the situation has fundamentally changed, brutally changed. On the one hand, we have Russia's aggression against Ukraine, but we know from the documents they exchanged with the Americans that it was not just about Ukraine. It's not just about Ukraine. Russia claims that basically Central Eastern Europe should be a special sphere of interest, which means the European Union would go into two parts, a secure part and a non-secure part. We could also frame it in a different way. Russia is proposing that we go back to the roots of the 19th century, of empire, of stronger and weaker, of territories which can be conquered. So we have a major conflict on how this continent should be organized. At the same time, we have a conflict which is not yet militarily conducted, but which has all the potential in the Pacific between China and the United States. And the structure of that conflict is very similar to the structure on the European continent before the First World War, which means up and coming industrialized power, starting a major fleet building program, China, challenging the established industrial power, United States, on the sea. If you remember from history, exactly the situation before the First World War, up and coming industrialized power, Germany, starting a major fleet building program under the Kaiser, challenging the established industrial power, United Kingdom, on the sea. Doesn't mean it has to have the same outcome, but it means this is a very dangerous and conflictual situation. And China has to push through. It cannot rely to be the traditional land power it was, because with that industrial production, it's dependent on raw material, it's dependent on foodstuff, it has to get it. And it cannot be dependent on the goodwill of the United States. And that's why the Taiwan conflict is not just about national unification. It's about that development model that China has established. Does it continue to be dependent on the goodwill of the United States, or can China secure its own existence in this form itself? And the third element, I'm very sorry to say this as a convinced transatlanticist, is the recent development in the United States. So if after 3 weeks we can draw some conclusions, always very difficult, but after 3 weeks I would draw tentatively the following 10 conclusions on how the United States is repositioning itself. The first is, we do not just have a problem with the person Donald Trump, which could be temporary and then the mandate is over. We have and we do not just have a problem in the United States. We have an underlying development, which I call the revolt of the lower middle class. It's the less educated, less earning, overrepresented with workers, overrepresented with the unemployed, who feel that our systems haven't delivered for them. And we see that with 30%, they could take over the Republican Party. But in Britain, we had for the first time last week, I think, Mr. Farage being number one. We are not that far. And we are having Le Pen with 30% in France. And we are having AfD with 22, 21, 22% in Germany. So we have a process of political change, of restructuring of the political system that's not just limited to the United States, but to Europe. So we would comfort ourselves too much if we would say our problem is Trump. So we have a development which is likely to stay and could even affect ourselves. Secondly, we see in the United States an enormous fusion of power, of financial power, of technological power, of media power and political power in one hand, which is the hands of Elon Musk. The richest man in the world is owning Twitter. He is controlling what's getting into space, because NASA was basically put out of business, and he is sitting more or less in the White House, wherever he has his office. Thirdly, we're seeing a change of the American system in the direction of executive dominance. The system was always balanced out between the legislative branch, the executive branch, the legal branch. We see it moving towards executive dominance. And the legislature might have to fight its way back through the legal system, and we will see how this ends up in Supreme Court. 4, we see a cultural counter-revolution. Counter-revolution to what? To the process which was set in March in 1968. Just some examples. The President of the United States announced the new president of the Kennedy Center, most important cultural institution in the United States, is now called Donald Trump. Also, US aid is being dismantled from 10,000 to 300 with the argument that they have a cultural agenda which is unacceptable. The Department of Education is more or less being dissolved. So what we are seeing is a cultural counter-revolution, and we see at least the beginning of the deconstruction of the administrative state in order to achieve permanence of these changes. And when you listen to Steve Bannon, he says, wonderful, that's exactly what we wanted. 6, and now we come to the foreign policy area. What is the sense of Panama, Mexico, Canada, Greenland, if there's any? The joint element is this is all the Western Hemisphere. American foreign policy before 1945 was policy in the Western Hemisphere. So that means the near, secure the near abroad. It's too early to say whether this is a strategy, a decisive policy choice, but for the moment we see a refocusing on the Western Hemisphere, and at the same time an emptying out of the instruments of international affairs. Speaking about US aid, I also had a meeting last week with one of the heads from the International Republican Institute, so Republican Party, and he told me until last Friday he had to fire half of his staff. Well, it's no longer financed. Important policy tools, National Democratic Institute, International Republican Institute, very important instruments for the international. So the international toolkit is being reduced and refocus on the Western Hemisphere. We see a support of the law of the stronger. We are going to get Greenland. I'm not speaking about Gaza. And we can see that for the first time, at least that I remember this, there is a very explicit support of this administration for forces very much to the right, to the sense that Marine Le Pen did not get an invitation to the inauguration, but her more right-wing competitor. Of course, AfD in Germany, of course, Farage in this country. And, you know, we are good allies, but we have to buy weapons, we have to buy gas. In traditional foreign affairs, this is not called allies, this is called a vassal. You have to buy your support function. I'm saying very happily, I hope this is completely exaggerated, but this is my personal conclusion after 3 weeks. So what I want to say is, we have trouble with Russia, we have trouble with China, and very unfortunately also the relationship with the United States has many more question marks than it used to have in the war in the past. So what does it mean for European defense? European governments are only taking major decisions of change with the back to the wall and looking into the abyss. Why? Because everything you give to Europe escapes national sovereignty. The moment you move it to Europe, it's no longer in your area of free decision making, it's with Europe. So we could see during the financial crisis, when did they take the most important decisions? On Sundays, when they were told, if you don't take that decisions, banks will not open on Monday. That's when they took the decision. So the question is it now sufficiently convincing that we have a war on the European continent, which is meant to go far beyond Ukraine, that we have a major challenge with China in the Pacific, and that thirdly, we have a big question mark behind the United States, let's say, security guarantee for Europe, or is it not enough? So any solution on European defense needs to square a number of circles. The first is it needs to be compatible with NATO. If not, we will be split right away. Secondly, it needs to allow for flexible adaptation over time dependent on the situation. In this sense, it's opportunistic. You can do something today, you do it. You can do something else, maybe in a month's time you do it. Then the budget is coming on, you do it. So it's not a big master plan, but you do it whenever you can do it. And three, you have to cut the issue into solvable bits. If the issue is to have tomorrow an army in military uniform, you make it unsolvable. Doesn't make sense. So you have to cut the issue into solvable bits that can be addressed one by one. And fourth, and that's my personal conclusion, capacity building has to be first. So first is not the army. First is capacity building, because if you don't have the capacity, don't think about the army. So I was asked nearly 2 years ago by the president of the Martens Centre, Miklas Dzurinda, former Prime Minister of Slovakia, to come up with a concept on European defense. And the latest version is called 70s Defense Extended. So it's now a paper of 100 pages with very detailed proposals with the help of external experts. And the concept is the security pyramid. And thank you, Richard, for your kind words about it. I'm not an expert on defense, so I've been writing the white chapter because I know the political side a bit. And then we brought in experts on the other ones. So what are these solvable bits? I think the issue has to be split in two. The first is production capability. If we don't have production capability on the European continent, everything will be very, very difficult, not to say impossible. Second, military mobility. Let's assume there's an attack on the Baltics. The key thing is, how do we get military equipment, staff there? Because if not, the war will be over before support has been arriving. That's a very good one for the European Union because we have already a budget line on military mobility. What does military mobility need? Roads, which are strong enough. Railway connections, which are leading sufficiently where they have to lead. Port infrastructure, so that things can be delivered. That's something the European Union is rather good at because that's what we do for a couple of decades. Good thing here, progress. The European Commission has decided about a month ago that member states now can use the regional funds, of which 93% have not been spent because of Next Generation EU for military mobility. So the financial side of military mobility is solved. For a European DARPA, the United States are saying you're falling behind technologically. Okay, European Union is doing traditionally research. So why not dedicate a part of the research for double use goods, military and civil? That's something the European Union can do. 5, filling strategic capability gaps. So where are the capability gaps? In space, in cyber, in long distance transport. space is something the European Union has been traditionally active in. If we are thinking, for example, of the Ariane program, so that's not outside our frame. 6, a European Civil Protection Service. There are already decisions in the area of wildfires. Portugal is helping Spain and so on. We could think this through also in case of military confrontation. Next, I would like to take institutional reform. So we proposed 1.5 years ago to have a European Commissioner for Defense, and we are now having a European Commissioner for Defense with Andrius Kubilius. And I think it's a good choice because as a Lithuanian, he knows if he's not successful, he's endangering potentially his own country. We proposed 1.5 years ago to have a fully fledged defense committee in the European Parliament. And we are now having a fully fledged defense committee in the European Parliament, not a subcommittee on foreign affairs. We also propose to have a standing council of defense ministers, which is not yet there. Of course, these are the issues which could form a base and where the European Union is absolutely in its traditional territory. That's what I mean with building the base. The Defense Commissioner has already said that he's in favor of a European DARPA. So what I would expect is that these issues are addressed one by one over the next months and years to build a solid base before we are then discussing a specific European military model, headquarters, and so on, in order to complete this. So what I'm saying is, the first precondition that this is a possibility is absolute necessity. I think we are as close as it can get to absolute necessity. The second is to divide a seemingly over-complex issues into individual solvable bits. That's what we have tried to do. And I see now, or if I just look back the last 6 months, that on a couple of fronts there has been tangible progress. I can add one more. I read, I think this morning in the Financial Times, about the new budget proposal of the European Union. So what is the idea? The idea is, if we can trust the Financial Times, but if we can no longer trust the Financial Times, who can we still trust? So I've opted to trust the Financial Times. So the idea seems to be to no longer have all these subheadings, but to have 3 major funds. And the third fund should serve especially to finance defense, with the possibility to move monies relatively easily back and forth, because a 7 years budget, many things can happen on the way. I take this as an additional indication that things are moving on the defense front. By the way, under President of the European Commission was Defense Minister and was absolutely dedicated to the